Section 19 of Celebrated Crimes, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Shelley van Wallichem. Celebrated Crimes, Volume 1, by Alexandre Dumas. Translated by G.B. Ives. Section 19. The Borgias. Chapter 10, Part 2. Almost at the same time, Rome was terrified by another murder. Don Giovanni Cerviglione, a gentleman by birth and a brave soldier, captain of the Pope's men-at-arms, was attacked one evening by the sbirri, as he was on his way home from supping with Don Alicio Pignatelli. One of the men asked his name, and as he pronounced it, seeing that there was no mistake, plunged a dagger into his breast, while a second man with the back stroke of his sword cut off his head, which lay actually at his feet before his body had time to fall. The governor of Rome lodged a complaint against this assassination with the Pope, but quickly perceiving by the way his intimation was received that he would have done better to say nothing, he stopped the inquiries he had started, so that neither of the murderers was ever arrested. But the rumour was circulated that Caesar, in the short stay he had made at Rome, had had a rendezvous with Cerviglione's wife, who was a Borgia by birth, and that her husband, when he heard of this infringement of conjugal duty, had been angry enough to threaten her and her lover too. The threat had reached Caesar's ears, who, making a long arm of Michelotto, had himself at Forli struck down Cerviglione in the street of Rome. Another unexpected death followed so quickly on that of Don Giovanni Cerviglione that it could not but be attributed to the same originator, if not the same cause. Monsignore Agnelli of Mantua, Archbishop of Cosenza, clerk of the chamber and vice-legate of Viterbo, having fallen into disgrace with his holiness, how it is not known, was poisoned at his own table, at which he had passed a good part of the night in cheerful conversation with 3 or 4 guests, the poison gliding meanwhile through his veins. Then, going to bed in perfect health, he was found dead in the morning. His possessions were at once divided into 3 portions. The land and houses were given to the Duke of Valentinois, the bishopric went to Francesco Borgia, son of Calixtus III, and the office of clerk of the chamber was sold for 5,000 ducats to Ventura Bonassai, a merchant of Siena, who produced this sum for Alexander, and settled down the very same day in the Vatican. This last death served the purpose of determining a point of law hitherto uncertain. As Monsignore Agnelli's natural heirs had made some difficulty about being disinherited, Alexander issued a brief, whereby he took from every cardinal and every priest the right of making a will, and declared that all their property should henceforth devolve upon him. But Caesar was stopped short in the midst of his victories. Thanks to the 200,000 ducats that yet remained in his treasury, Ludovicus Sforza had levied 500 men-at-arms from Burgundy and 8,000 Swiss infantry, with whom he had entered Lombardy. So Trivulz, to face this enemy, had been compelled to call back Yves d'Allegre and the troops that Louis XII had lent to Caesar. Consequently, Caesar, leaving behind a body of pontifical soldiery as garrison at Forli and Imola, betook himself with the rest of his force to Rome. It was Alexander's wish that his entry should be a triumph, so when he learned that the quartermasters of the army were only a few leagues from the town, he sent out runners to invite the royal ambassadors, the cardinals, the prelates, the Roman barons and municipal dignitaries to make procession with all their suite to meet the Duke of Valentinois, and, as it always happens, that the pride of those who command is surpassed by the baseness of those who obey, the orders were not only fulfilled to the letter, but beyond it. The entry of Cesar took place on the 26th of February, 1500. Although this was the great Jubilee year, the festivals of the Carnival began none the less for that, and were conducted in a manner even more extravagant and licentious than usual, and the conqueror, after the first day, prepared a new display of ostentation, which he concealed under the veil of a masquerade. As he was pleased to identify himself with the glory, genius, and fortune of the great man whose name he bore, he resolved on a representation of the triumph of Julius Caesar, to be given on the Piazza di Navona, the ordinary place for holding the carnival fete. The next day, therefore, he and his retinue started from that square, and traversed all the streets of Rome, wearing classical costumes and riding in antique cars, on one of which Caesar stood, clad in the robe of an emperor of old, his brow crowned with a golden laurel wreath, surrounded by lictors, soldiers, and ensign-bearers, who carried banners whereon was inscribed the motto, Aut Caesar, aut nihil. Finally, on the fourth Sunday in Lent, the Pope conferred upon Caesar the dignity he had so long coveted, and appointed him general and gonfaloniere of the Holy Church. In the meanwhile Sforza had crossed the Alps and passed the Lake of Como, amid acclamations of joy from his former subjects, who had quickly lost the enthusiasm that the French army and Louis's promises had inspired. These demonstrations were so noisy at Milan, that Trivulus, judging that there was no safety for a French garrison in remaining there, made his way to Novara. Experience proved that he was not deceived, for scarcely had the Milanese observed his preparation for departure, when a suppressed excitement began to spread through the town, and soon the streets were filled with armed men. This murmuring crowd had to be passed through, sword in hand and lance in rest, and scarcely had the French got outside the gates when the mob rushed out after the army into the country, pursuing them with shouts and hooting as far as the banks of the Ticino. Trivulus left 400 lances at Novara, as well as 3,000 Swiss that Yves d'Alegre had brought from the Romagna, and directed his course with the rest of the army towards Mortara, where he stopped at last to await the help he had demanded from the King of France. Behind him Cardinal Ascanio and Ludovico entered Milan amid the acclamations of the whole town. Neither of them lost any time, and wishing to profit by this enthusiasm, Ascanio undertook to besiege the castle of Milan, while Ludovico should cross up the Ticino and attack Novara. The besiegers and besieged were sons of the same nation, for Yves d'Alegre had scarcely as many as 300 French with him, and Ludovico 500 Italians. In fact, for the last 16 years, the Swiss had been practically the only infantry in Europe, and all the powers came, purse in hand, to draw from the mighty reservoir of their mountains. The consequence was that these rude children of William Tell, put up to auction by the nations, and carried away from the humble hardy life of a mountain people into cities of wealth and pleasure, had lost, not their ancient courage, but that rigidity of principle for which they had been distinguished before their intercourse with other nations. From being models of honour and good faith, they had become a kind of marketable ware, always ready for sale to the highest bidder. The French were the first to experience this venality, which later on proved so fatal to Ludovico Sforza. Now the Swiss in the garrison at Novara had been in communication with their compatriots in the vanguard of the ducal army, and when they found that they, who as a fact were unaware that Ludovico's treasure was nearly exhausted, were better fed as well as better paid than themselves, they offered to give up the town and go over to the Milanese if they could be certain of the same pay. Ludovico, as we may well suppose, closed with this bargain. The whole of Novara was given up to him except the citadel, which was defended by Frenchmen. Thus the enemy's army was recruited by 3,000 men. Then Ludovico made the mistake of stopping to besiege the castle instead of marching on to Mortara with a new reinforcement. The result of this was that Louis XII, to whom runners had been sent by Trivulus, understanding his perilous position, hastened the departure of the French gendarmerie, who were already collected to cross into Italy, sent off the bailiff of Dijon to levy new Swiss forces, and ordered Cardinal Ambroise, his prime minister, to cross the Alps and take up a position at Asti, to hurry on the work of collecting the troops. There the cardinal found a nest egg of 3,000 men. La Trémouille added 1,500 lancers and 6,000 French infantry. Finally, the bailiff of Dijon arrived with 10,000 Swiss, so that, counting the troops which Trivulus had at Mortara, Louis XII found himself master on the other side of the Alps of the first army any French king had ever led out to battle. Soon, by good marching, and before Ludovico knew the strength of or even the existence of this army, it took up a position between Novara and Milan, cutting off all communication between the duke and his capital. He was, therefore, compelled, in spite of his inferior numbers, to prepare for a pitched battle. But it so happened that just when the preparations for a decisive engagement were being made on both sides, the Swiss Diet, learning that the sons of Helvetia were on the point of cutting one another's throats, sent orders to all the Swiss serving in either army to break their engagements and return to the fatherland. But during the 2 months that had passed between the surrender of Novara and the arrival of the French army before the town, there had been a very great change in the face of things, because Ludovico Sforza's treasure was now exhausted. New confabulations had gone on between the outposts, and this time, thanks to the money sent by Louis XII, it was the Swiss in the service of France who were found to be the better fed and the better paid. The worthy Helvetians, since they no longer fought for their own liberty, knew the value of their blood too well to allow a single drop of it to be spilt for less than its weight in gold. The result was that, as they had betrayed Yves d'Allegre, they resolved to betray Ludovico Sforza too, and while the recruits brought in by the bailiff of Dijon were standing firmly by the French flag, careless of the order of the Diet, Ludovico's auxiliaries declared that in fighting against their Swiss brethren, they would be acting in disobedience to the Diet, and would risk capital punishment in the end, a danger that nothing would induce them to incur unless they immediately received the arrears of their pay. The Duke, who had spent the last ducat he had with him, and was entirely cut off from his capital, knew that he could not get money till he had fought his way through to it, and therefore invited the Swiss to make one last effort, promising them not only the pay that was in arrears, but a double hire. But unluckily the fulfilment of this promise was dependent on the doubtful issue of a battle, and the Swiss replied that they had far too much respect for their country to disobey its decree, and that they loved their brothers far too well to consent to shed their blood without reward, and therefore Sforza would do well not to count upon them, since indeed the very next day they proposed to return to their homes. The Duke then saw that all was lost, but he made a last appeal to their honour, adjuring them at least to ensure his personal safety by making it a condition of capitulation. But they replied that even if a condition of such a kind would not make capitulation impossible, it would certainly deprive them of advantages which they had a right to expect, and on which they counted as indemnification for the arrears of their pay. They pretended, however, at last that they were touched by the prayers of the man whose orders they had obeyed so long, and offered to conceal him, dressed in their clothes, among their ranks. This proposition was barely plausible, for Sforza was short, and by this time an old man, and he could not possibly escape recognition in the midst of an army where the oldest was not past 30, and the shortest not less than 5'6". Still, this was his last chance, and he did not reject it at once, but tried to modify it, so that it might help him in his trades. His plan was to disguise himself as a Franciscan monk, so that mounted on a shabby horse he might pass for their chaplain. The others, Galeazzo di San Severino, who commanded under him, and his 2 brothers, were all tall men, so, adopting the dress of common soldiers, they hoped they might escape detection in the Swiss ranks. Scarcely were these plans settled, when the Duke heard that a capitulation was signed between Trivulzio and the Swiss, who had made no stipulation in favour of him and his generals. They were to go over the next day with arms and baggage right into the French army, so the last hope of the wretched Ludovico and his generals must needs be in their disguise. And so it was. San Severino and his brothers took their place in the ranks of the infantry, and Sforza took his among the baggage, clad in a monk's frock, with the hood pulled over his eyes. The army marched off, but the Swiss, who had first trafficked in their blood, now trafficked in their honour. The French were warned of the disguise of Sforza and his generals, and thus they were all 4 recognized, and Sforza was arrested by Trémouille himself. It is said that the price paid for this treason was the town of Bellinzona, for it then belonged to the French, and when the Swiss returned to their mountains and took possession of it, Louis XII took no steps to get it back again. When Ascanio Sforza, who, as we know, had stayed at Milan, learned the news of this cowardly desertion, he supposed that his cause was lost, and that it would be the best plan for him to fly, before he found himself a prisoner in the hands of his brother's old subjects. Such a change of face on the people's part would be very natural, and they might propose perhaps to purchase their own pardon at the price of his liberty. So he fled by night with the chief nobles of the Ghibelline party, taking the road to Piacenza on his way to the kingdom of Naples. But when he arrived at Rivolta, he remembered that there was living in that town an old friend of his childhood, by name Conrad Lando, whom he had helped to much wealth in his days of power, and as Ascanio and his companions were extremely tired, he resolved to beg his hospitality for a single night. Conrad received them with every sign of joy, putting all his house and servants at their disposal. But scarcely had they retired to bed, when he sent a runner to Piacenza to inform Carlo Orsini, at that time commanding the Venetian garrison, that he was prepared to deliver up Cardinal Ascanio and the chief men of the Milanese army. Carlo Orsini did not care to resign to another so important an expedition, and mounting hurriedly with 25 men, he first surrounded Conrad's house, and then entered, sword in hand, the chamber wherein Ascanio and his companions lay, and being surprised in the middle of their sleep, they yielded without resistance. The prisoners were taken to Venice, but Louis XII claimed them, and they were given up. Thus the King of France found himself master of Ludovico Sforza and of Ascanio, of a legitimate nephew of the great Francesco Sforza, named Hermes, of the 2 bastards, named Alessandro and Cortino, and of Francesco, son of the unhappy John Galeazzo, who had been poisoned by his uncle. Louis XII, wishing to make an end of the whole family at a blow, forced Francesco to enter cloister, shut up Cardinal Ascanio in the tower of Borgias, threw into prison Alessandro, Cortino, and Hermes, and finally, after transferring the wretched Ludovico from the fortress of Pierre-Roussis to Lys Saint-Georges, he relegated him for good and all to the castle of Loches, where he lived for 10 years in solitude and utter destitution, and there died, cursing the day when the idea first came into his head of enticing the French into Italy. The news of the catastrophe of Ludovico and his family caused the greatest joy at Rome, for, while the French were consolidating their power in Milanese territory, the Holy See was gaining ground in the Romagna, where no further opposition was offered to Caesar's conquest. So the runners who brought the news were rewarded with valuable presents, and it was published throughout the whole town of Rome, to the sound of the trumpet and drum. The war cry of Louis, France, and that of Orsina also, ran through all the streets, which in the evening were illuminated, as though Constantinople or Jerusalem had been taken. And the Pope gave the people fêtes and fireworks, without troubling his head the least in the world, either about its being a holy week, or because the Jubilee had attracted more than 200,000 people to Rome, the temporal interests of his family seeming to him far more important than the spiritual interests of his subjects. End of section 19.
Of Celebrated Crimes, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Morgan Scorpion. Celebrated Crimes, Volume 1 by Alexandre Dumas. Translated by G.B. Ives. Section 20. The Borgias, Chapter 11, Part 1. One thing alone was wanting to assure the success of the vast projects that the Pope and his son were founding upon the friendship of Louis and an alliance with him, that is, money. But Alexander was not the man to be troubled about a paltry worry of that kind. True, the sale of benefices was by now exhausted, the ordinary and extraordinary taxes had already been collected for the whole year, and the prospect of inheritance from cardinals and priests was a poor thing now that the richest of them had been poisoned. But Alexander had other means at his disposal, which were none the less efficacious because they were less often used. The first he employed was to spread a report that the Turks were threatening an invasion of Christendom, and that he knew for a positive fact that before the end of the summer Bajazet would land 2 considerable armies, one in Romagna, the other in Calabria. He therefore published 2 bulls, one to levy tithes of all ecclesiastical revenues in Europe of whatever nature they might be, the other to force the Jews into paying an equivalent sum. Both bulls contained the severest sentences of excommunication against those who refused to submit, or attempted opposition. The second plan was the selling of indulgences, a thing which had never been done before. These indulgences affected the people who had been prevented by reasons of health or business from coming to Rome for the Jubilee. The journey by this expedient was rendered unnecessary, and sins were pardoned for a third of what it would have cost, and just as completely as if the faithful had fulfilled every condition of the pilgrimage. For gathering in this tax, a veritable army of collectors was instituted, a certain Lodovico della Torre at their head. The sum that Alexander brought into the pontifical treasury is incalculable, and some idea of it may be gathered from the fact that 799,000 livres in gold was paid in from the territory of Venice alone. But as the Turks did as a fact make some sort of demonstration from the Hungarian side, and the Venetians began to fear that they might be coming in their direction, they asked for help from the Pope, who gave orders that at 12 o'clock in the day, in all his states an Ave Maria should be said to pray God to avert the danger which was threatening the most serene republic. This was the only help the Venetians got from his Holiness in exchange for the 799,000 livres in gold that he had got from them. But it seemed as though God wished to show his strange vicar on earth that he was angered by the mockery of sacred things, and on the eve of St. Peter's Day, just as the Pope was passing the Campanile on his way to the tribune of benedictions, an enormous piece of iron broke off and fell at his feet, and then, as though one warning had not been enough, on the next day, St. Peter's, when the Pope happened to be in one of the rooms of his ordinary dwelling with the Cardinal Capuano and Monsignore Poto, his private chamberlain, he saw through the open windows that a very black cloud was coming up. Foreseeing a thunderstorm, he ordered the cardinal and the chamberlain to shut the windows. He had not been mistaken, for even as they were obeying his command, there came up such a furious gust of wind that the highest chimney of the Vatican was overturned, just as a tree is rooted up, and was dashed upon the roof, breaking it in, smashing the upper flooring. It fell into the very room where they were. Terrified by the noise of this catastrophe, which made the whole palace tremble, the cardinal and Monsignore Poto turned round, and seeing the room full of dust and debris, sprang out upon the parapet and shouted to the guards at the gate: "The Pope is dead! The Pope is dead!" At this cry the guards ran up, and discovered 3 persons lying in the rubbish on the floor, one dead and the other 2 dying. The dead man was a gentleman of Siena called Lorenzo Chigi, and the dying were 2 resident officials of the Vatican. They had been walking across the floor above, and had been flung down with the debris. But Alexander was not to be found, and as he gave no answer, though they kept on calling to him, the belief that he had perished was confirmed, and very soon spread about the town. But he had only fainted, and at the end of a certain time he began to come to himself, and moaned, whereupon he was discovered, dazed with the blow, and injured, though not seriously, in several parts of his body. He had been saved by little short of a miracle. A beam had broken in half, and had left each of its 2 ends in the side walls, and one of these had formed a sort of roof over the pontifical throne. The Pope, who was sitting there at the time, was protected by this overarching beam, and had received only a few contusions. The 2 contradictory reports of the sudden death and the miraculous preservation of the Pope spread rapidly through Rome, and the Duke of Valentinois, terrified at the thought of what a change might be wrought in his own fortunes by any slight accident to the Holy Father, hurried to the Vatican, unable to assure himself by anything less than the evidence of his own eyes. Alexander desired to render public thanks to Heaven for the protection that had been granted him, and on the very same day was carried to the church of Santa Maria del Popolo, escorted by a numerous procession of prelates and men at arms, his pontifical seat borne by 2 valets, 2 equerries, and 2 grooms. In this church were buried the Duke of Gandia and Gian Borgia, and perhaps Alexander was drawn thither by some relics of devotion, or maybe by the recollection of his love for his former mistress, Rosa Bonazza, whose image, in the guise of the Madonna, was exposed for the veneration of the faithful in a chapel on the left of the high altar. Stopping before this altar, the Pope offered to the church the gift of a magnificent chalice in which were 300 gold crowns, which the Cardinal of Siena poured out into a silver paten before the eyes of all, much to the gratification of the pontifical vanity. But before he left Rome to complete the conquest of the Romagna, the Duke of Valentinois had been reflecting that the marriage, once so ardently desired, between Lucrezia and Alfonso had been quite useless to himself and his father. There was more than this to be considered. Louis XII's rest in Lombardy was only a halt, and Milan was evidently but the stage before Naples. It was very possible that Louis was annoyed about the marriage which converted his enemy's nephew into the son-in-law of his ally. Whereas, if Alfonso were dead, Lucrezia would be in the position to marry some powerful lord of Ferrara or Brescia, who would be able to help his brother-in-law in the conquest of Romagna. Alfonso was now not only useless but dangerous, which to any one with the character of the Borgias perhaps seemed worse. The death of Alfonso was resolved upon. But Lucrezia's husband, who had understood for a long time past what danger he incurred by living near his terrible father-in-law, had retired to Naples. Since, however, neither Alexander nor Caesar had changed in their perpetual dissimulation towards him, he was beginning to lose his fear, when he received an invitation from the Pope and his son to take part in a bullfight which was to be held in the Spanish fashion in honor of the Duke before his departure. In the present precarious position of Naples, it would not have been good policy for Alfonso to afford Alexander any sort of pretext for a rupture, so he could not refuse without a motive, and betook himself to Rome. It was thought of no use to consult Lucrezia in this affair, for she had 2 or 3 times displayed an absurd attachment for her husband, and they left her undisturbed in her government of Spoleto. Alfonso was received by the Pope and the Duke with every demonstration of sincere friendship, and rooms in the Vatican were assigned to him that he had inhabited before with Lucrezia, in that part of the building which is known as the Torre Nuova. Great lists were prepared on the piazza of St. Peter's, the streets about it were barricaded, and the windows of the surrounding houses served as boxes for the spectators. The Pope and his court took their places on the balconies of the Vatican. The fete was started by professional toreadors, after they had exhibited their strength and skill. Alfonso and Caesar in their turn descended to the arena, and to offer a proof of their mutual kindness, settled that the bull which pursued Caesar should be killed by Alfonso, and the bull that pursued Alfonso by Caesar. Then Caesar remained alone on horseback within the lists, Alfonso going out by an improvised door which was kept ajar, in order that he might go back on the instant if he judged that his presence was necessary. At the same time, from the opposite side of the lists the bull was introduced, and was at the same moment pierced all over with darts and arrows, some of them containing explosives, which took fire, and irritated the bull to such a point that he rolled about with pain, and then got up in a fury, and perceiving a man on horseback, rushed instantly upon him. It was now, in this narrow arena, pursued by his swift enemy, that Caesar displayed all that skill which made him one of the finest horsemen of the period. Still, clever as he was, he could not have remained safe long in that restricted area from an adversary against whom he had no other resource than flight, had not Alfonso appeared suddenly, just when the bull was beginning to gain upon him, waving a red cloak in his left hand, and holding in his right a long, delicate Aragon sword. It was high time. The bull was only a few paces distant from Caesar, and the risk he was running appeared so imminent that a woman's scream was heard from one of the windows. But at the sight of a man on foot the bull stopped short, and judging that he would do better business with the new enemy than the old one, he turned upon him instead. For a moment he stood motionless, roaring, kicking up the dust with his hind feet, and lashing his sides with his tail. Then he rushed upon Alfonso, his eyes all bloodshot, his horns tearing up the ground. Alfonso awaited him with a tranquil air. Then, when he was only 3 paces away, he made a bound to one side and presented instead of his body his sword, which disappeared at once to the hilt. The bull, checked in the middle of his onslaught, stopped one instant motionless and trembling, then fell upon his knees, uttered one dull roar, and lying down on the very spot where his course had been checked, breathed his last without moving a single step forward. Applause resounded on all sides, so rapid and clever had been the blow. Caesar had remained on horseback, seeking to discover the fair spectator who had given so lively a proof of her interest in him, without troubling himself about what was going on. His search had not been unrewarded, for he had recognized one of the maids of honor to Elizabeth, Duchess of Urbino, who was betrothed to Gian Battista Caricualo, Captain General of the Republic of Venice. It was now Alfonso's turn to run from the bull, Caesar's to fight him. The young men changed parts, and when 4 mules had reluctantly dragged the dead bull from the arena, and the valets and other servants of his Holiness had scattered sand over the places that were stained with blood, Alfonso mounted a magnificent Andalusian steed of Arab origin, light as the wind of Sahara that had wedded with his mother, while Caesar, dismounting, retired in his turn, to reappear at the moment when Alfonso should be meeting the same danger from which he had just now rescued him. Then a second bull was introduced upon the scene, excited in the same manner with steel darts and flaming arrows. Like his predecessor, when he perceived a man on horseback he rushed upon him, and then began a marvellous race, in which it was impossible to see, so quickly did they fly over the ground, whether the horse was pursuing the bull, or the bull the horse. But after 5 or 6 rounds, the bull began to gain upon the son of Araby, for all his speed, and it was plain to see who fled and who pursued. In another moment there was only the length of 2 lances between them, and then suddenly Caesar appeared, armed with one of those long 2-handed swords which the French are accustomed to use, and just when the bull, almost close upon Don Alfonso, came in front of Caesar he brandished the sword, which flashed like lightning and cut off his head, while his body, impelled by the speed of the run, fell to the ground 10 paces farther on. This blow was so unexpected, and had been performed with such dexterity, that it was received, not with mere clapping, but with wild enthusiasm and frantic outcry. Caesar, apparently remembering nothing else in his hour of triumph but the scream that had been caused by his former danger, picked up the bull's head, and, giving it to one of his equerries, ordered him to lay it, as an act of homage, at the feet of the fair Venetian who had bestowed upon him so lively a sign of interest. This fate, besides affording a triumph to each of the young men, had another end as well. It was meant to prove to the populace that perfect goodwill existed between the two, since each had saved the life of the other. The result was, that, if any accident should happen to Caesar, nobody would dream of accusing Alfonso, and if any accident should happen to Alfonso, nobody would dream of accusing Caesar. There was a supper at the Vatican. Alfonso made an elegant toilet, and about 10 o'clock at night prepared to go from the quarters he inhabited into those where the Pope lived. But the door which separated the two courts of the building was shut, and knock as he would, no one came to open it. Alfonso then thought that it was a simple matter for him to go round by the Piazza of St. Peter. So he went out unaccompanied through one of the garden gates of the Vatican and made his way across the gloomy streets which led to the stairway which gave on the piazza. But scarcely had he set foot on the first step when he was attacked by a band of armed men. Alfonso would have drawn his sword, but before it was out of the scabbard he had received 2 blows from a halberd, one on his head, the other on his shoulder. He was stabbed in the side, and wounded both in the leg and in the temple. Struck down by these 5 blows, he lost his footing and fell to the ground unconscious. His assassins, supposing he was dead, at once remounted the stairway, and found on the piazza 40 horsemen waiting for them. By them they were calmly escorted from the city by the Porta Portesa. Alfonso was found at the point of death, but not actually dead, by some passers-by, some of whom recognized him, and instantly conveyed the news of his assassination to the Vatican, while the others, lifting the wounded man in their arms, carried him to his quarters in the Torre Nuova. The Pope and Caesar, who learned this news just as they were sitting down to table, showed great distress, and leaving their companions, at once went to see Alfonso, to be quite certain whether his wounds were fatal or not, and on the next morning, to divert any suspicion that might be turned towards themselves, they arrested Alfonso's maternal uncle, Francesco Gazella, who had come to Rome in his nephew's company. Gazella was found guilty on the evidence of false witnesses, and was consequently beheaded. But they had only accomplished half of what they wanted. By some means, fair or foul, suspicion had been sufficiently diverted from the true assassins. But Alfonso was not dead. And thanks to the strength of his constitution and the skill of his doctors, who had taken the lamentations of the Pope and Caesar quite seriously, and thought to please them by curing Alexander's son-in-law, the wounded man was making progress towards convalescence. News arrived at the same time that Lucrezia had heard of her husband's accident, and was starting to come and nurse him herself. There was no time to lose, and Caesar summoned Michelotto. The same night, says Bucardus, Don Alfonso, who would not die of his wounds, was found strangled in his bed. The funeral took place the next day with a ceremony not unbecoming in itself, though unsuited to his high rank. Don Francesco Borgia, Archbishop of Cosenza, acted as chief mourner at St. Peter's, where the body was buried in the chapel of Santa Maria della Febbre. Lucrezia arrived the same evening. She knew her father and brother too well to be put on the wrong scent, and although immediately after Alfonso's death the Duke of Valentinois had arrested the doctors, the surgeons, and a poor deformed wretch who had been acting as valet, she knew perfectly well from what quarter the blow had proceeded. In fear, therefore, that the manifestation of a grief she felt at this time too well might alienate the confidence of her father and brother, she retired to Nepi with her whole household, her whole court, and more than 600 cavaliers, there to spend the period of her mourning. This important family business was now settled, and Lucrezia was again a widow, and in consequence ready to be utilized in the Pope's new political machinations. Caesar only stayed at Rome to receive the ambassadors from France and Venice, but as their arrival was somewhat delayed, and considerable inroads had been made upon the Pope's treasury by the recent festivities, the creation of 12 new cardinals was arranged. This scheme was to have 2 effects, viz., to bring 600,000 ducats into the pontifical chest, each hat having been priced at 50,000 ducats, and to assure the Pope of a constant majority in the Sacred Council. End of section number 20. Of Celebrated Crimes, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, Please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Morgan Scorpion. Celebrated Crimes, Volume 1 by Alexandre Dumas. Translated by G.B. Ives. Section 21. The Borgias, Chapter 11, Part 2. The ambassadors at last arrived. The first was Monsieur de Villeneuve, the same who had come before to see the Duke of Valentinois in the name of France. Just as he entered Rome, he met on the road a masked man who, without removing his domino, expressed the joy he felt at his arrival. This man was Caesar himself, who did not wish to be recognized, and who took his departure after a short conference without uncovering his face. Monsieur de Villeneuve then entered the city after him, and at the Porta del Populo found the ambassadors of the various powers, and among them those of Spain and Naples, whose sovereigns were not yet, it is true, in declared hostility to France, though there was already some coolness. The last named, fearing to compromise themselves, merely said to their colleague of France, by way of complimentary address, "Sir, you are welcome," whereupon the master of the ceremonies, surprised at the brevity of the greeting, asked if they had nothing else to say. When they replied that they had not, Monsieur de Villeneuve turned his back upon them, remarking that those who had nothing to say required no answer. He then took his place between the Archbishop of Regia, governor of Rome, and the Archbishop of Ragusa, and made his way to the Palace of the Holy Apostles, which had been got ready for his reception. Some days later, Maria Giorgi, ambassador extraordinary of Venice, made his arrival. He was commissioned not only to arrange the business on hand with the Pope, but also to convey to Alexander and Caesar the title of Venetian nobles, and to inform them that their names were inscribed in the Golden Book, a favour that both of them had long coveted, less for the empty honour's sake than for the new influence that this title might confer. Then the Pope went on to bestow the 12 cardinals' hats that had been sold. The new princes of the church were Don Diego de Mendoza, Archbishop of Seville, Jacques, Archbishop of Oristagni, the Pope's Vicar General, Thomas, Archbishop of Strigania, Piero, Archbishop of Reggio, Governor of Rome, Francesco Bargia, Archbishop of Cosenza, Treasurer General, Gian, Archbishop of Salerno, Vice Chamberlain, Luigi Bargia, Archbishop of Valencia, Secretary to His Holiness, and brother of the Gian Borgia whom Caesar had poisoned, Antonio, Bishop of Coma, Gian Battista Ferraro, Bishop of Modena, Amadei de Albret, son of the King of Navarre, brother-in-law of the Duke of Valentinois, and Marco Cornaro, a Venetian noble, in whose person His Holiness rendered back to the most serene Republic the favour he had just received. Then, as there was nothing further to detain the Duke of Valentinois at Rome, he only waited to effect a loan from a rich banker named Agostino Chigi, brother of the Lorenzo Chigi, who had perished on the day when the Pope had been nearly killed by the fall of a chimney, and departed for the Romagna, accompanied by Vitellozzo Vitelli, Gian Paolo Baglioni, and Jacopo di Santa Croce, at the time his friends, but later on his victims. His first enterprise was against Pesaro. This was the polite attention of a brother-in-law, and Gian Sforza very well knew what would be its consequences, for instead of attempting to defend his possessions by taking up arms, or venture on negotiations, unwilling moreover to expose the fair lands he had ruled so long to the vengeance of an irritated foe, he begged his subjects to preserve their former affection towards himself, in the hope of better days to come, and he fled into Dalmatia. Malatesta, lord of Rimini, followed his example. Thus the Duke of Valentinois entered both these towns without striking a single blow. Caesar left a sufficient garrison behind him, and marched on to Faenza. But there the face of things was changed. Faenza at that time was under the rule of Astor Manfredi, a brave and handsome young man of 18, who, relying on the love of his subjects towards his family, had resolved on defending himself to the uttermost, although he had been forsaken by the Bentivogli, his near relatives, and by his allies, the Venetian and Florentines, who had not dared to send him any aid because of the affection felt towards Caesar by the King of France. Accordingly, when he perceived that the Duke of Valentinois was marching against him, he assembled in hot haste all those of his vassals who were capable of bearing arms, together with the few foreign soldiers who were willing to come into his pay, and collecting victual and ammunition, he took up his position with them inside the town. By these defensive preparations Caesar was not greatly disconcerted. He commanded a magnificent army, composed of the finest troops of France and Italy, led by such men as Paolo and Giulio Orsini, Vitellozzo Vitelli, and Paolo Baglione, not to speak of himself, that is to say, by the first captains of the period. So, after he had reconnoitred, he at once began the siege, pitching his camp between the two rivers, Amanna and Marziano, placing his artillery on the side which faces on Forli, at which point the besieged army had erected a powerful bastion. At the end of a few days busy with entrenchments, the breach became practicable, and the Duke of Valentinois ordered an assault, and gave the example to his soldiers by being the first to march against the enemy. But in spite of his courage and that of his captains beside him, Astromanfredi made so good a defense that the besiegers were repulsed with great loss of men, while one of their bravest leaders, Onario Savella, was left behind in the trenches. But Faenza, in spite of the courage and devotion of her defenders, could not have held out long against so formidable an army, had not winter come to her aid. Surprised by the rigor of the season, with no houses for protection and no trees for fuel, as the peasants had destroyed both beforehand, the Duke of Valentinois was forced to raise the siege and take up his winter quarters in the neighboring towns, in order to be quite ready for a return next spring, for Caesar could not forgive the insult of being held in check by a little town which had enjoyed a long time of peace, was governed by a mere boy, and deprived of all outside aid, and had sworn to take his revenge. He therefore broke up his army into 3 sections, sent 1/3 to Imola, the second to Forli, and himself took the third to Cesena, a third-rate town, which was thus suddenly transformed into a city of pleasure and luxury. Indeed, for Caesar's active spirit there must needs be no cessation of warfare or festivities; so, when war was interrupted, fetes began, as magnificent and as exciting as he knew how to make them. The days were passed in games and displays of horsemanship, the nights in dancing and gallantry, for the loveliest woman of the Romagna, that is to say of the whole world, had come hither to make a seraglio for the victor, which might have been envied by the Sultan of Egypt or the Emperor of Constantinople. While the Duke of Valentinois was making one of his excursions in the neighborhood of the town with his retinue of flattering nobles and titled courtesans, who were always about him, he noticed a cortege on the Rimini road, so numerous that it must surely indicate the approach of someone of importance. Caesar, soon perceiving that the principal person was a woman, approached, and recognized the very same lady in waiting to the Duchess of Urbino who, on the day of the bullfight, had screamed when Caesar was all but touched by the infuriated beast. At this time she was betrothed, as we mentioned, to Gian Caracciulola, general of the Venetians. Elizabeth of Gonzaga, her protectress and grandmother, was now sending her with a suitable retinue to Venice, where the marriage was to take place. Caesar had already been struck by the beauty of this young girl when at Rome, but when he saw her again she appeared more lovely than on the first occasion; so he resolved on the instant that he would keep this fair flower of love for himself, having often before reproached himself for his indifference in passing her by. Therefore he saluted her as an old acquaintance, inquired whether she was staying any time at Cesena, and ascertained that she was only passing through, travelling by long stages, as she was awaited with much impatience, and that she would spend the coming night at Forli. This was all that Caesar cared to know. He summoned Micheletto, and in a low voice said a few words to him, which were heard by no one else. The cortege only made a halt at the neighboring town, as the fair bride had said, and started at once for Forli, although the day was already far advanced. But scarcely had a league been covered when a troop of horsemen from Cesena overtook and surrounded them. Although the soldiers in the escort were far from being in sufficient force, they were eager to defend their general's bride; but soon some fell dead, and others, terrified, took to flight; and when the lady came down from her litter to try to escape, the chief seized her in his arms and set her in front of him on his horse; then, ordering his men to return to Cesena without him, he put his horse to the gallop in a cross direction, and as the shades of evening were now beginning to fall, he soon disappeared into the darkness. Caracciolo learned the news through one of the fugitives, who declared that he had recognized among the ravishers the Duke of Valentinois' soldiers. At first he thought his ears had deceived him, so hard was it to believe this terrible intelligence; but it was repeated, and he stood for one instant motionless and, as it were, thunderstruck. Then suddenly, with a cry of vengeance, he threw off his stupor and dashed away to the ducal palace, where sat the Doge Barberigo and the Council of Ten. Unannounced he rushed into their midst, the very moment after they had heard of Caesar's outrage. "Most serene lords," he cried, "I am come to bid you farewell, for I am resolved to sacrifice my life to my private vengeance, though indeed I had hoped to devote it to the service of the Republic. I have been wounded in the soul's noblest part, in my honour. The dearest thing I possessed, my wife, has been stolen from me, and the thief is the most treacherous, the most impious, the most infamous of men. It is Valentinois. My lords, I beg you will not be offended if I speak thus of a man whose boast it is to be a member of your noble ranks, and to enjoy your protection. It is not so. He lies, and his loose and criminal life has made him unworthy of such honours, even as he is unworthy of the life whereof my sword shall deprive him. In truth, his very birth was a sacrilege. He is a fratricide, a usurper of the goods of other men, an oppressor of the innocent, and a highway assassin. He is a man who will violate every law, even the law of hospitality respected by the veriest barbarian, a man who will do violence to a virgin who is passing through his own country, where she had every right to expect from him not only the consideration due to her sex and condition, but also that which is due to the most serene republic, whose condottieri I am, and which is insulted in my person and in the dishonouring of my bride. This man, I say, merits indeed to die by another hand than mine. Yet, since he who ought to punish him is not for him a prince and judge, but only a father quite as guilty as the son, I myself will seek him out, and I will sacrifice my own life, not only in avenging my own injury, and the blood of so many innocent beings, but also in promoting the welfare of the most serene republic, on which it is his ambition to trample when he has accomplished the ruin of the other princes of Italy." The Doge and the senators, who, as we said, were already apprised of the event that had brought Caracciolo before them, listened with great interest and profound indignation, for they, as he told them, were themselves insulted in the person of their general. They all swore, on their honour, that if he would put the matter in their hands, and not yield to his rage, which could only work his own undoing, either his bride should be rendered up to him without a smirch upon her bridal veil, or else a punishment should be dealt out proportioned to the affront. And without delay, as a proof of the energy wherewith the noble tribunal would take action in the affair, Luigi Manetti, secretary to the Ten, was sent to Imola, where the duke was reported to be, that he might explain to him the great displeasure with which the most serene republic viewed the outrage perpetrated upon their condottieri. At the same time the Council of Ten and the Doge sought out the French ambassador, entreating him to join with them and repair in person with Menenti to the Duke of Valentinois, and summon him, in the name of King Louis XII, immediately to send back to Venice the lady he had carried off. The two messengers arrived at Imola, where they found Caesar, who listened to their complaint with every mark of utter astonishment, denying that he had been in any way connected with the crime, nay, authorizing Menenti and the French ambassador to pursue the culprits, and promising that he would himself have the most active search carried on. The duke appeared to act in such complete good faith that the envoys were for the moment hoodwinked, and themselves undertook a search of the most careful nature. They accordingly repaired to the exact spot and began to procure information. On the highroad there had been found dead and wounded. A man had been seen going by at a gallop, carrying a woman in distress on his saddle. He had soon left the beaten track and plunged across country. A peasant coming home from working in the fields had seen him appear and vanish again like a shadow, taking the direction of a lonely house. An old woman declared that she had seen him go into this house, but the next night the house was gone, as though by enchantment, and the ploughshare had passed over where it stood, so that none could say what had become of her whom they sought, for those who had dwelt in the house, and even the house itself, were there no longer. Menenti and the French ambassador returned to Venice, and related what the duke had said, what they had done, and how all search had been in vain. No one doubted that Caesar was the culprit, but none could prove it. So the most serene republic, which could not, considering their war with the Turks, be embroiled with the Pope, forbade Caracciolo to take any sort of private vengeance, and so the talk grew gradually less, and at last the occurrence was no more mentioned. But the pleasures of the winter had not diverted Caesar's mind from his plans about Faenza. Scarcely did the spring season allow him to go into the country than he marched anew upon the town, camped opposite the castle, and, making a new breach, ordered a general assault, himself going up first of all. But in spite of the courage he personally displayed, and the able seconding of his soldiers, they were repulsed by Astor, who, at the head of his men, defended the breach, while even the women, at the top of the rampart, rolled down stones and trunks of trees upon the besiegers. After an hour's struggle man to man, Caesar was forced to retire, leaving 2,000 men in the trenches about the town, and among the 2,000 one of his bravest condottieri, Valentino Farnese. Then, seeing that neither excommunications nor assaults could help him, Caesar converted the siege into a blockade. All the roads leading to Faenza were cut off, all communications stopped, and further, as various signs of revolt had been remarked at Cesena, a governor was installed there whose powerful will was well known to Caesar, Ramiro d'Orco, with powers of life and death over the inhabitants. He then waited quietly before Faenza, till hunger should drive out the citizens from those walls they defended with such vehement enthusiasm. At the end of a month, during which the people of Faenza had suffered all the horrors of famine, delegates came out to parley with Caesar with a view to capitulation. Caesar, who still had plenty to do in the Romagna, was less hard to satisfy than might have been expected, and the town yielded on condition that he should not touch either the persons or the belongings of the inhabitants; that Alstor Manfredi, the youthful ruler, should have the privilege of retiring whenever he pleased, and should enjoy the revenue of his patrimony wherever he might be. The conditions were faithfully kept so far as the inhabitants were concerned, but Caesar, when he had seen Astor, whom he did not know before, was seized by a strange passion for this beautiful youth, who was like a woman. He kept him by his side in his own army, showing him honours befitting a young prince, and evincing before the eyes of all the strongest affection for him. One day Astor disappeared, just as Caracciolo's bride had disappeared, and no one knew what had become of him. Caesar himself appeared very uneasy, saying that he had no doubt made his escape somewhere, and in order to give credence to this story, he sent out couriers to seek him in all directions. A year after this double disappearance, there was picked up in the Tiber, a little below the castle St. Angelo, the body of a beautiful woman, her hands bound together behind her back, and also the corpse of a handsome youth, with the bowstring he had been strangled with tied around his neck. The girl was Caracciolo's bride, the young man was Astor. During the last year both had been the slaves of Caesar's pleasures. Now tired of them, he had had them thrown into the Tiber. The capture of Faenza had brought Caesar the title of Duke of Romagna, which was first bestowed on him by the Pope in full consistory, and afterwards ratified by the King of Hungary, the Republic of Venice, and the Kings of Castile and Portugal. The news of the ratification arrived at Rome on the eve of the day on which the people are accustomed to keep the anniversary of the foundation of the Eternal City. This fete, which went back to the days of Pomponius Laetus, acquired a new splendor in their eyes from the joyful events that had just happened to their sovereign. As a sign of joy, cannon were fired all day long. In the evening there were illuminations and bonfires, and during part of the night the Prince of Squillace, with the chief lords of the Roman nobility, marched about the streets, bearing torches and exclaiming, "Long live Alexander! Long live Caesar! Long live the Borgias! Long live the Orsini! Long live the Duke of Romagna!" Section 21.
Section 22 of Celebrated Crimes, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kevin Maxon. Celebrated Crimes, Volume 1 by Alexandre Dumas. Translated by G.B. Ives, Section 22, The Borgias. Chapter 12. Caesar's ambition was only fed by victories. Scarcely was he master of Faenza before, excited by the Mariscotti, old enemies of the Bentivoglio family, he cast his eyes upon Bologna. But Gian de Bentivoglio, whose ancestors had possessed this town from time immemorial, had not only made all preparations necessary for a long resistance, but he had also put himself under the protection of France. so scarcely had he learned that Caesar was crossing the frontier of the Bolognese territory with his army, than he sent a courier to Louis XII to claim the fulfillment of his promise. Louis kept it with his accustomed good faith, and when Caesar arrived before Bologna, he received an intimation from the King of France that he was not to enter on any undertaking against his ally Bentivoglio. Caesar, not being the man to have his plans upset for nothing, made conditions for his retreat, to which Bentivoglio consented, only too happy to be quit of him at this price. The conditions were the cession of Castello Bolognese, a fortress between Imola and Faenza, the payment of a tribute of 9,000 ducats, and the keeping for his service of 100 men-at-arms and 2,000 infantry. In exchange for these favors, Caesar confided to Bentivoglio that his visit had been due to the counsels of the Mariscotti. Then, reinforced by his new allies' contingent, he took the road for Tuscany. But he was scarcely out of sight when Bentivoglio shut the gates of Bologna, and commanded his son Hermes to assassinate with his own hand Agamemnon Mariscotti, the head of the family, and ordered the massacre of 34 of his near relatives, brothers, sons, daughters, and nephews, and 200 other of his kindred and friends. The butchery was carried out by the noblest youths of Bologna, whom Bentivoglio forced to bathe their hands in this blood, so that he might attach them to himself through their fear of reprisals. Caesar's plans with regard to Florence were now no longer a mystery. Since the month of January he had sent to Pisa for 10 or 1200 men under the command of Raniero della Sassetta and Piero da Gamba Corti, and as soon as the conquest of the Romagna was complete, he had further dispatched Oliverotto di Fermo with new detachments. His own army had he reinforced, as we have seen, by 100 men-at-arms and 2,000 infantry. He had just been joined by Vitellozzo Vitelli, lord of Città di Castello, and by the Orsini, who had brought him another 2,000 or 3,000 men. So without counting the troops sent to Pisa, he had under his control 700 men-at-arms and 5,000 infantry. Still, in spite of this formidable company, he entered Tuscany declaring that his intentions were only pacific, protesting that he only desired to pass through the territories of the Republic on his way to Rome, and offering to pay in ready money for any victual his army might require. But when he had passed the defiles of the mountains and arrived at Barberino, feeling that the town was in his power, and nothing could now hinder his approach, he began to put a price on the friendship he had at first offered freely, and to impose his own conditions, instead of accepting those of others. These were that Piero de' Medici, kinsman and ally of the Orsini, should be reinstated in his ancient power, that 6 Florentine citizens, to be chosen by Vitellozzo, should be put into his hands, that they might by their death expiate that of Paolo Vitelli, unjustly executed by the Florentines, that the Signoria should engage to give no aid to the Lord of Piombino, whom Caesar intended to dispossess of his estates without delay, and further, that he himself should be taken into the service of the Republic, for a pay proportionate to his deserts. But just as Caesar had reached this point in his negotiations with Florence, he received orders from Louis XII to get ready, so soon as he conveniently could, to follow him with his army, and to help in the conquest of Naples, which he was at last in a position to undertake. Caesar dared not break his word to so powerful an ally. He therefore replied that he was at the king's orders, and as the Florentines were not aware that he was acquitting them on compulsion, he sold his retreat for the sum of 36,000 ducats per annum, in exchange for which sum he was to hold 300 men-at-arms, always in readiness to go to the aid of the Republic at her earliest call, and in any circumstances of need. But hurried as he was, Caesar still hoped that he might find time to conquer the territory of Piombino as he went by, and take the capital by a single vigorous stroke. So he made his entry into the lands of Jacopo IV of Appiano. The latter, he found, however, had been beforehand with him, and, to rob him of all resource, had laid waste in his own country, burned his fodder, felled his trees, torn down his vines, and destroyed a few fountains that produced salubrious waters. This did not hinder Caesar from seizing in the space of a few days Severeto, Scarlino, the Isle of Elba, and La Pianosa, but he was obliged to stop short at the castle, which opposed a serious resistance. As Louis XII's army was continuing its way towards Rome, and he received a fresh order to join it, he took his departure the next day, leaving behind him Vitellozzo and Gianpaolo Bagliani to prosecute the siege in his absence. Louis XII was this time advancing upon Naples, not with the incautious ardor of Charles VIII, but, on the contrary, with that prudence and circumspection which characterized him. Besides his alliance with Florence and Rome, he had also signed a secret treaty with Ferdinand the Catholic, who had similar pretensions, through the house of Duras, to the throne of Naples, to those Louis himself had through the house of Anjou. By this treaty the two kings were sharing their conquests beforehand. Louis would be the master of Naples, of the town of Lavore and the Abruzzi, and would bear the title of King of Naples and Jerusalem. Ferdinand reserved for his own share the Apulia and Calabria, with the title of Duke of these provinces. Both were to receive the investiture from the Pope, and to hold them of him. This partition was all the more likely to be made, in fact, because Frederick, supposing all the time that Ferdinand was his good and faithful friend, would open the gates of his towns, only to receive into his fortresses conquerors and masters, instead of allies. All this perhaps was not very loyal conduct on the part of a king who had so long desired, and had just now received the surname of Catholic, but it mattered little to Louis, who profited by treasonable acts he did not have to share. The French army, which the Duke of Valentinois had just joined, consisted of 1,000 lances, 4,000 Swiss, and 6,000 Gascons and adventurers. Further, Philip of Rabenstein was bringing by sea 6 Breton and Provençal vessels, and 3 Genoese carracks, carrying 6,500 invaders. Against this mighty host, the King of Naples had only 700 men-at-arms, 600 light horse, and 6,000 infantry under the command of the Colonna, whom he had taken into his pay after they were exiled by the Pope from the states of the Church. But he was counting on Gonsalvo of Cordova, who was to join him at Gaeta, and to whom he had confidingly opened all his fortresses in Calabria. But the feeling of safety inspired by Frederick's faithless ally was not destined to endure long. On their arrival at Rome, the French and Spanish ambassadors presented to the Pope the treaty signed at Granada on the 11th of November, 1500, between Louis XII and Ferdinand the Catholic, a treaty which up to that time had been secret. Alexander, foreseeing the probable future, had, by the death of Alfonso, loosened all the bonds that attached him to the house of Aragon, and then began by making some difficulty about it. It was demonstrated that the arrangement had only been undertaken to provide the Christian princes with another weapon for attacking the Ottoman Empire, and before this consideration, one may readily suppose, all the Pope's scruples vanished. On the 25th of June, therefore, it was decided to call a consistory which was to declare Frederick deposed from the throne of Naples. When Frederick had heard all at once that the French army had arrived at Rome, that his ally Ferdinand had deceived him, and that Alexander had pronounced the sentence of his downfall, he understood that all was lost. But he did not wish it to be said that he had abandoned his kingdom without even attempting to save it. So he charged his 2 new condottieri, Fabrizio Colonna and Manuzia di Marciano, to check the French before Capua with 300 men-at-arms, some light horse, and 3,000 infantry. In person he occupied Aversa with another division of his army, while Prospero Colonna was sent to defend Naples with the rest, and make a stand against the Spaniards on the side of Calabria. These dispositions were scarcely made when d'Aubigné, having passed the Volturno, approached to lay siege to Capua, and invested the town on both sides of the river. Scarcely were the French encamped before the ramparts, that they began to set up their batteries, which were soon in play, much to the terror of the besieged, who, poor creatures, were almost strangers to the town, and had fled thither from every side, expecting to find protection beneath the walls. So although bravely repulsed by Fabrizio Colonna, the French, from the moment of their first assault, inspired so great and blind a terror that everyone began to talk of opening the gates, and it was only with great difficulty that Colonna made this multitude understand that at least they ought to reap some benefit from the check the besiegers had received, and obtain good terms of capitulation. When he had brought them round to his view, he sent out to demand a parley with d'Aubigné, and a conference was fixed for the next day but one in which they were to treat of the surrender of the town. But this was not Caesar Borgia's idea at all. He had stayed behind to confer with the Pope, and had joined the French army with some of his troops on the very day on which the conference had been arranged for 2 days later, and a capitulation of any nature would rob him of his share of the booty and the promise of such pleasure as would come from the capture of a city so rich and populous as Capua. So he opened up negotiations on his own account, with a captain who was on guard at one of the gates, Such negotiations, made with cunning supported by bribery, proved as usual more prompt and efficacious than any others. At the very moment when Fabrizio Colonna, in a fortified outpost, was discussing the conditions of capitulation with the French captains, suddenly great cries of distress were heard. These were caused by Borgia, who without a word to anyone had entered the town with his faithful army from Romagna, and was beginning to cut the throats of the garrison, which had naturally somewhat relaxed their vigilance in the belief that the capitulation was all but signed. The French, when they saw that the town was half taken, rushed on the gates with such impetuosity that the besieged did not even attempt to defend themselves any longer, and forced their way into Capua by 3 separate sides. Nothing more could be done then to stop the issue. Butchery and pillage had begun, and the work of destruction must needs be completed. In vain did Fabrizio Colonna, Ranuzio di Mazziano, and Don Ugo di Cordona attempt to make head against the French and Spaniards with such men as they could get together. Fabrizio Colonna and Don Ugo were made prisoners. Ranuzio, wounded by an arrow, fell into the hands of the Duke of Valentinois. 7,000 inhabitants were massacred in the streets, among them the traitor who had given up the gate. The churches were pillaged, the convents of nuns forced open, and then might be seen the spectacle of some of these holy virgins casting themselves into pits, or into the river to escape the soldiers. 300 of the noblest ladies of the town took refuge in a tower. The Duke of Valentinois broke in the doors, chased out for himself 40 of the most beautiful, and handed over the rest to his army. The pillage continued for 3 days. Capua once taken, Frederick saw that it was useless any longer to attempt defense, so he shut himself up in Castel Nuovo, and gave permission to Gaeta and to Naples to treat with the conqueror. Gaeta brought him immunity from pillage with 60,000 ducats, and Naples with the surrender of the castle. This surrender was made to Daubigny by Frederick himself, a condition that he should be allowed to take the island of Ischia, his money, jewels, and furniture, and there remain with his family for 6 months secure from all hostile attack. The terms of this capitulation were faithfully adhered to on both sides. Daubigny entered Naples, and Frederick retired to Ischia. Thus, by a last terrible blow, never to rise again, fell this branch of the House of Aragon, which had now reigned for 65 years. Frederick, its head, demanded and obtained safe conduct to pass into France, where Louis XII gave him the Duchy of Anjou and 30,000 ducats a year, and conditioned that he should never quit the kingdom, and there, in fact, he died, on the 9th of September, 1504. His eldest son, Dan Ferdinand, Duke of Calabria, retired to Spain, where he was permitted to marry twice, but each time with a woman who was known to be barren, and there he died in 1550. Alfonso, the second son, who had followed his father to France, died, it is said, of poison at Grenoble, at the age of 22. Lastly, Caesar, the third son, died at Ferrara, before he had attained his 18th birthday. Frederick's daughter Charlotte married in France Nicholas, Count of Laval, governor and admiral of Brittany. A daughter was born of this marriage, Anne de Laval, who married Francois de la Trémouille. Through her, those rights were transferred to the house of La Trémouille, which were used later as a claim upon the kingdom of the Two Sicilies. The capture of Naples gave the Duke of Valentinois his liberty again, so he left the French army after he had received fresh assurances on his own account of the king's friendliness, and returned to the siege of Piombino, which he had been forced to interrupt. During this interval, Alexander had been visiting the scenes of his son's conquests, and traversing all the Romagna with Lucrezia, who was now consoled for her cousin's death, and had never before enjoyed such favor with his holiness. So, when she returned to Rome, she no longer had separate rooms from him. The result of this recrudescence of affection was the appearance of 2 pontifical bulls, converting the towns of Nepi and Sermonetta into duchies. One was bestowed on John Borgia, an illegitimate child of the Pope, who was not the son of either of his mistresses, Rosa Vanozza or Giulia Varnese. The other, and Don Roderico of Aragon, son of Lucrezia and Alfonso. The lands of the Colonna were an appanage to the 2 duchies. But Alexander was dreaming of yet another addition to his fortune. This was to come from a marriage between Lucrezia and Don Alfonso d'Este, son of Duke Hercules of Ferrara, in favor of which alliance Louis XII had negotiated. His Holiness was now having a run of good fortune, and he learned on the same day that Piombino was taken, and that Duke Hercules had given the King of France his assent to the marriage. Both of these pieces of news were good for Alexander, but the one could not compare in importance with the other. And the intimation that Lucrezia was to marry the heir presumptive to the Duchy of Ferrara was received with a joy so great that it smacked of the humble beginnings of the Borgian house. The Duke of Valentinois was invited to return to Rome, to take his share in the family rejoicing, and on the day when the news was made public, the governor of Sant'Angelo received orders that cannon should be fired every quarter of an hour from noon to midnight. At 2 o'clock Lucrezia, attired as a fiancée, and accompanied by her two brothers, the Dukes of Valentinois and Squillace, issued from the Vatican, followed by all the nobility of Rome, and proceeded to the church of the Madonna del Popolo, where the Duke of Gandia and Cardinal Gian Borgia were buried, to render thanks for this new favor accorded to their house by God. And in the evening, accompanied by the same cavalcade, which shone the more brightly under the torchlight and brilliant illuminations, she made procession through the whale town, greeted by cries of "Long live Pope Alexander VI! Long live the Duchess of Ferrara!" which were shouted aloud by heralds clad in cloth of gold. The next day an announcement was made in the town that a race course for the women was opened between the castle of Sant'Angelo and the Piazza of St. Peter's, that on every third day there would be a bullfight in the Spanish fashion, and that from the end of the present month, which was October, until the first day of Lent, masquerades would be permitted in the streets of Rome. Such was the nature of the fetes outside. The program of those going on within the Vatican was not presented to the people, for by the account of Bucciardo, an eye-witness, this is what happened. On the last Sunday of the month of October, 50 courtesans supped in the Apostolic Palace in the Duke of Valentinois' rooms, and after supper danced with the equerries and servants, first wearing their usual garments, afterwards in dazzling draperies. When supper was over, the table was removed, candlesticks were set on the floor in a symmetrical pattern, and a great quantity of chestnuts was scattered on the ground. These the 50 women skilfully picked up, running about gracefully in and about between the burning lights. The Pope, the Duke of Valentinois, and his sister Lucrezia, who were looking on at this spectacle from a gallery, encouraged the most agile and industrious with their applause, and they received prizes of embroidered garters, velvet boots, golden caps, and laces. Then new diversions took the place of these. We humbly ask forgiveness of our readers, and especially of our lady readers, but though we have found words to describe the first part of the spectacle, we have sought them in vain for the second. Suffice it to say, that just as there had been prizes for feats of adroitness, others were given now to the dancers who were most daring and brazen. Some days after this strange night, which calls to mind the Roman evenings in the days of Tiberius, Nero, and Heliogabalus, Lucrezia, clad in a robe of golden brocade, her train carried by young girls dressed in white and crowned with roses, issued from her palace to the sound of trumpets and clarions, and made her way over carpets that were laid down in the streets through which she had to pass. Accompanied by the novelist cavaliers and the loveliest women in Rome, she betook herself to the Vatican, where in the Pauline Hall the Pope waited her, with the Duke of Valentinois, Don Ferdinand acting as proxy for the Duke Alfonso, and his cousin, Cardinal d'Este. The Pope sat on one side of the table, while the envoys from Ferrara stood on the other. In their midst came Lucrezia, and Don Ferdinand placed on her finger the nuptial ring. This ceremony over, Cardinal d'Este approached and presented to the bride 4 magnificent rings set with precious stones. Then a casket was placed on the table, richly inlaid with ivory, whence the cardinal drew forth a great many trinkets, chains, necklaces of pearls and diamonds, of workmanship as costly as their material. These he also begged Lucrezia to accept, before she received those the bridegroom was hoping to offer himself, which would be more worthy of her. Lucrezia showed the utmost delight in accepting these gifts. Then she retired into the next room, leaning on the Pope's arm, and followed by the ladies of her suite, leaving the Duke of Valentinois to do the honors of the Vatican to the men. That evening the guests met again, and spent half the night in dancing, while a magnificent display of fireworks lighted up the Piazza of San Paolo. The ceremony of betrothal over, the Pope and the Duke busied themselves with making preparations for the departure. The Pope, who wished the journey to be made with a great degree of splendor, sent in his daughter's company, in addition to the 2 brothers-in-law and gentlemen in their suite, the Senate of Rome and all the lords who, by virtue of their wealth, could display most magnificence in their costumes and liveries. Among this brilliant throng might be seen Olivero and Ramiro Mattei, sons of Piero Mattei, chancellor of the town, and a daughter of the Pope whose mother was not Rosa Venozza. Besides these, the Pope nominated in consistory Francesco Borgia, cardinal of the Cosenza, legate alla terre, to accompany his daughter to the frontiers of the ecclesiastical states. Also, the Duke of Valentinois sent out messengers into all the cities of Romagna to order that Lucrezia should be received as sovereign lady and mistress. Grand preparations were at once set on foot for the fulfillment of his orders. But the messengers reported that they greatly feared that there would be some grumbling at Cesena, where it will be remembered that Caesar had left Ramiro d'Orco as governor, with plenary powers, to calm the agitation of the town. Now, Ramiro d'Orco had accomplished his task so well that there was nothing more to fear in the way of rebellion, for 1/6 of the inhabitants had perished on the scaffold, and the result of this situation was that it was improbable that the same demonstrations of joy could be expected from a town plunged in mourning that were looked for from Imola, Faenza, and Pizarro. The Duke of Valentinois averted this inconvenience in the prompt and efficacious fashion characteristic of him alone. One morning the inhabitants of Cesena awoke to find a scaffold set up in the square, and upon it the 4 quarters of a man, his head, severed from the trunk, stuck upon the end of a pike. This man was Ramiro d'Orco. No one ever knew by whose hands the scaffold had been raised by night, nor by what executioners the terrible deed had been carried out. But when the Florentine Republic set to ask Machiavelli, their ambassador at Cesena, what he thought of it, he replied, "Magnificent lords, I can tell you nothing concerning the execution of Ramiro d'Orco, except that Caesar Borgia is the prince who best knows how to make and unmake men according to their deserts. Niccolo Machiavelli." The Duke of Valentinois was not disappointed, and the future Duchess of Ferrara was admirably received in every town along her route, and particularly at Cesena. While Lucrezia was on her way to Ferrara to meet her 4th husband, Alexander, and the Duke of Valentinois resolved to make progress in the region of their last conquest, the Duchy of Piombino. The apparent object of this journey was that the new subjects might take their oath to Caesar, and the real object was to form an arsenal in Jacopo d'Appiano's capital, within the reach of Tuscany, a plan which neither the Pope nor his son had ever seriously abandoned. The two accordingly started from the port of Corneto, with 6 ships, accompanied by a great number of cardinals and prelates, and arrived that same evening in Piombino. The pontifical court made a stay there of several days, partly with the view of making the Duke known to the inhabitants, and also in order to be present at certain ecclesiastical functions, of which the most important was a service held on the 3rd Sunday in Lent, in which the Cardinal of Cosenza sang a mass, and the Pope officiated in state with the Duke and the cardinals. After these solemn functions, the customary pleasures followed, and the Pope summoned the prettiest girls of the country and ordered them to dance their national dances before him. Following on these dances came feasts of unheard-of magnificence, during which the Pope in the sight of all men completely ignored Lent, and did not fast. The object of all these fetes was to scatter abroad a great deal of money, and so to make the Duke of Valentinois popular, while poor Jacopo d'Appiano was forgotten. When they left Piombino, the Pope and his son visited the island of Elba, where they only stayed long enough to visit the old fortifications and issue orders for the buildings of new ones. Then the illustrious travellers embarked upon their return journey to Rome, but scarcely had they put out to sea when weather became adverse, and the Pope not wishing to put in at Porto Ferrajo, they remained 5 days on board, though they had only 2 days' provisions. During the last 3 days, the Pope lived on fried fish that were caught under great difficulties because of the heavy weather. At last they arrived in sight of Corneto, and there the Duke, who was not on the same vessel as the Pope, seeing that his ship could not get in, had a boat put out, and so was taken ashore. The Pope was obliged to continue on his way towards Pontacole, where at last he arrived, after encountering so violent a tempest that all who were with him were utterly subdued by either sickness or the terror of death. The Pope alone did not show one instant's fear, but remained on the bridge during the storm, sitting on his armchair, invoking the name of Jesus and making the sign of the cross. At last his ship entered the roads of Pontacole, where he landed, and after sending to Corneto to fetch horses, he rejoined the Duke, who was there awaiting him. Then they returned by slow stages, by way of Civita Vecchia and Paolo, and reached Rome after an absence of a month. Almost at the same time d'Albret arrived in quest of his cardinal's hat. He was accompanied by 2 princes of the house of Navarre, who were received not only with those honours which beseemed their rank, but also as brother-in-laws, to whom the Duke was eager to show in what spirit he was contracting this alliance. End of section 22.
Section 23 of Celebrated Crimes, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Morgan Scorpion. Celebrated Crimes, Volume 1 by Alexandre Dumas. Translated by G.B. Ives. Section 23. The Borgias. Chapter 13, Part 1. The time had now come for the Duke of Valentinois to continue the pursuit of his conquests. So, since on the 1st of May in the preceding year the Pope had pronounced sentence of forfeiture in full consistory against Julius Caesar of Verano, as punishment for the murder of his brother Rudolph for the harbouring of the Pope's enemies, and he had accordingly been mulcted of his fief of Camerino, which was to be handed over to the Apostolic Chamber, Caesar left Rome to put the sentence in execution. Consequently, when he arrived on the frontiers of Perugia, which belonged to his lieutenant, Gianpaolo Baglioni, he sent Oliverotto da Fermo and Orsini of Guerini to lay waste the march of Camerino, at the same time petitioning Guido Gilbaldo di Montefeltro, Duke of Urbino, to lend his soldiers and artillery to help him in this enterprise. The unlucky Duke of Urbino, who enjoyed the best possible relations with the Pope, and who had no reason for distrusting Caesar, did not dare refuse. But on the very same day that the Duke of Urbino's troops started for Camerino, Caesar's troops entered the duchy of Urbino, and took possession of Caldi, one of the 4 towns of the little state. The Duke of Urbino knew what awaited him if he tried to resist, and fled incontinently, disguised as a peasant. Thus, in less than 8 days, Caesar was master of his whole duchy, except the fortress of Maiolo and San Leone. The Duke of Valentinois forthwith returned to Camerino, where the inhabitants still held out, encouraged by the presence of Julius Caesar di Verano, their lord, and his 2 sons, Venantio and Hannibal. The eldest son, Gian Maria, had been sent by his father to Venice. The presence of Caesar was the occasion of parleying between the besiegers and besieged. A capitulation was arranged whereby Verano engaged to give up the town, on condition that he and his sons were allowed to retire safe and sound, taking with them their furniture, treasure, and carriages. But this was by no means Caesar's intention, so, profiting by the relaxation in vigilance that had naturally come about in the garrison when the news of the capitulation had been announced, he surprised the town in the night preceding the surrender, and seized Caesar di Verano and his 2 sons, who were strangled a short time after, the father at La Pergola and the sons at Pesaro, by Don Michel Corelio, who, though he had left the position of sbirro for that of a captain, every now and then returned to his first business. Meanwhile Vitellozzo Vitelli, who had assumed the title of General of the Church, and had under him 800 men-at-arms and 3,000 infantry, was following the secret instructions that he had received from Caesar by word of mouth, and was carrying forward that system of invasion which was to encircle Florence in a network of iron, and in the end make her defence an impossibility. A worthy pupil of his master, in whose school he had learned to use in turn the cunning of a fox and the strength of a lion, he had established an understanding between himself and certain young gentlemen of Arezzo to get that town delivered into his hands. But the plot had been discovered by Guglielmo degli Pazzi, commissary of the Florentine Republic, and he had arrested 2 of the conspirators, whereupon the others, who were much more numerous than was supposed, had instantly dispersed about the town, summoning the citizens to arms. All the Republican faction, who saw in any sort of revolution the means of subjugating Florence, joined their party, set the captives at liberty, and seized Guglielmo, Then, proclaiming the establishment of the ancient constitution, they besieged the citadel, whither Cosimo dei Pazzi, bishop of Arezzo, the son of Guglielmo, had fled for refuge. He, finding himself invested on every side, sent a messenger in hot haste to Florence to ask for help. Unfortunately for the cardinal, Vitellozzo's troops were nearer to the besiegers than were the soldiers of the most serene republic to the besieged, and instead of help, the whole army of the enemy came down upon him. This army was under the command of Vitellozzo, of Gianpaolo Baglioni, and of Fabio Orsino, and with them were the two Medici, ever ready to go wherever there was a league against Florence, and ever ready, at the command of Borgia, on any conditions whatsoever, to re-enter the town whence they had been banished. The next day more help in the form of money and artillery arrived, sent by Pandolfo Petrucci, and on the 18th of June the citadel of Arezzo, which had received no news from Florence, was obliged to surrender. Vitellozzo left the men of Arezzo to look after their town themselves, leaving also Fabio Orsina to garrison the citadel with 1,000 men. Then, profiting by the terror that had been spread throughout all this part of Italy by the successive captures of the duchy of Urbino, of Camerino, and of Arezzo, he marched upon Monte San Severino, Castiglione, Aretino, Cortone, and the other towns of the valley of Chiana, which submitted one after the other almost without a struggle. When he was only 10 or 12 leagues from Florence, and dared not, on his own account, attempt anything against her, he made known the state of affairs to the Duke of Valentinois. He, fancying the hour had come at last, for striking the blow so long delayed, started off at once to deliver his answer in person to his faithful lieutenants. But the Florentines, though they had sent no help to Guglielmo dei Pazzi, had demanded aid from Chalmont d'Umbest, governor of the Milanese, on behalf of Louis XII., not only explaining the danger they themselves were in, but also Caesar's ambitious projects, namely, that after first overcoming the small principalities and then the states of the second order, he had now, it seemed, reached such a height of pride that he would attack the King of France himself. The news from Naples was disquieting. Serious differences had already occurred between the Count of Armagnac and Gonzalvo di Cordova, and Louis might any day need Florence, whom he had always found loyal and faithful. He therefore resolved to check Caesar's progress, and not only sent him orders to advance no further, step forwards, but also sent off, to give effect to his injunction, the Captain Imbo with 400 lances. The Duke of Valentinois, on the frontier of Tuscany, received a copy of the treaty signed between the Republic and the King of France, a treaty in which the king engaged to help his ally against any enemy whatsoever, and at the same moment the formal prohibition from Louis to advance any further. Caesar also learned that beside the 400 lances with the Captain Imbo, which were on the road to Florence, Louis XII. Had, as soon as he reached Asti, sent off to Parma Louis de la Tromouille and 200 men at arms, 3,000 Swiss, and a considerable train of artillery. In these two movements combined, he saw hostile intentions toward himself, and, turning right about face with his usual agility, he profited by the fact that he had given nothing but verbal instructions to all his lieutenants, and wrote a furious letter to Vitellozzo, reproaching him for compromising his master with a view to his own private interest, and ordering the instant surrender to the Florentines of the towns and fortresses he had taken, threatening to march down with his own troops and take them if he hesitated for a moment. As soon as this letter was written, Caesar departed for Milan, where Louis XII. Had just arrived, bringing with him proof positive that he had been calumniated in the evacuation of the conquered towns. He also was entrusted with the Pope's mission to renew for another 18 months the title of Legate a Latere in France to Cardinal d'Umbest, the friend rather than the minister of Louis XII. Thus, thanks to the public proof of his innocence and private use of his influence, Caesar soon made his peace with the King of France. But this was not all. It was in the nature of Caesar's genius to divert an impending calamity that threatened his destruction so as to come out of it better than before, and he suddenly saw the advantage he might take from the pretended disobedience of his lieutenants. Already he had been disturbed now and again by their growing power, and coveted their towns. Now he thought the hour had perhaps come for suppressing them also. and in the usurpation of their private possessions striking a blow at Florence, who always escaped him at the very moment when he thought to take her. It was indeed an annoying thing to have these fortresses and towns displaying another banner than his own in the midst of the beautiful Romagna which he desired for his own kingdom. For Vitellozzo possessed Città di Castello, Bentivoglio Bologna, Gianpaolo Baglioni was in command of Perugia, Oliverotto had just taken Fermo, and Pandolfo Petrucci was lord of Siena. It was high time that all these returned into his own hands. The lieutenants of the Duke of Valentinois, like Alexander's, were becoming too powerful, and Borgia must inherit from them, unless he were willing to let them become his own heirs. He obtained from Louis XII 300 lances wherewith to march against them. As soon as Vitellozzo Vitelli received Caesar's letter, he perceived that he was being sacrificed to the fear that the King of France inspired. But he was not one of those victims who suffer their throats to be cut in the expiation of a mistake. He was a buffalo of Romagna who opposed his horns to the knife of the butcher. Besides, he had the example of Varano and the Manfredi before him, and, death for death, he preferred to perish in arms. So Vitellozzo convoked at Magione all whose lives or lands were threatened by this new reversal of Caesar's policy. These were Paolo Orsino, Gianpaolo Baglioni, Hermes Bentivoglio, representing his father Gian, Antonio di Venafro, the envoy of Pandolfo Petrucci, Oliver Toxo da Fermo, and the Duke of Urbino. The first 6 had everything to lose, and the last had already lost everything. A treaty of alliance was signed between the confederates. They engaged to resist, whether he attacked them severally or all together. Caesar learned the existence of this league by its first effects. The Duke of Urbino, who was adored by his subjects, had come with a handful of soldiers to the fortress of San Leone, and it had yielded at once. In less than a week, towns and fortresses followed this example, and all the duchy was once more in the hands of the Duke of Urbino. At the same time, each member of the confederacy openly proclaimed his revolt against the common enemy, and took up a hostile attitude. Caesar was at Imola, awaiting the French troops, but with scarcely any men, so that Bentivoglio, who held part of the country, and the Duke of Urbino, who had just reconquered the rest of it, could probably have either taken him or forced him to fly and quit the Romagna, had they marched against him; all the more since the 2 men on whom he counted, viz. Don Ugo di Cardona, who had entered his service after Capua was taken, and Micheletto, had mistaken his intention, and were all at once separated from him. He had really ordered them to fall back upon Rimini, and bring 200 light horse and 500 infantry, of which they had the command; but, unaware of the urgency of his situation, at the very moment when they were attempting to surprise La Pergola and Fossombrone, they were surrounded by Orsino of Gravina and Vitellozzo. Ugo di Cardona and Micheletto defended themselves like lions, but in spite of their utmost efforts, their little band was cut to pieces, and Ugo di Cardona taken prisoner, while Micheletto only escaped the same fate by lying down among the dead. When night came on, he escaped to Fano. But even alone as he was, almost without troops at Imola, the confederates dared attempt nothing against Caesar, whether because of the personal fear he inspired, or because in him they respected the ally of the King of France. They contented themselves with taking the towns and fortresses in the neighbourhood. Vitellozzo had retaken the fortresses of Fossombrone, Urbino, Cali, and Agobbio. Orsino of Gravina had reconquered Fano and the whole province, while Gian Maria di Verano, the same who by his absence had escaped being massacred with the rest of his family, had re-entered Camerino, borne in triumph by his people. Not even all this could destroy Caesar's confidence in his own good fortune, and while he was on the one hand urging on the arrival of the French troops, and calling in to his prey all those gentlemen known as broken lances, because they went about the country in parties of 5 or 6 only, and attached themselves to anyone who wanted them, he had opened up negotiations with his enemies, certain that from that very day when he should persuade them to a conference they were undone. Indeed, Caesar had the power of persuasion as a gift from heaven, and though they perfectly well knew his duplicity, they had no power of resisting. Not so much of his actual eloquence, as that air of frank good nature which Machiavelli so greatly admired, and which indeed more than once deceived even him, wily politician as he was. In order to get Paolo Orsino to treat with him at Imola, Caesar sent Cardinal Borgia to the confederates as a hostage, and on this Paolo Orsino hesitated no longer, and on the 25th of October, 1502, arrived at Imola. Caesar received him as an old friend, from whom one might have been estranged a few days, because of some slight passing differences. He frankly avowed that all the fault was no doubt on his side, since he had contrived to alienate men who were such loyal lords and also such brave captains. But with men of their nature, he added, an honest, honourable explanation, such as he would give, must put everything once more in statu quo. To prove that it was goodwill, not fear, that brought him back to them, he showed Orsino the letters from Cardinal Ambroise, which announced the speedy arrival of French troops. He showed him those he had collected about him, in the wish, he declared, that they might be thoroughly convinced that what he chiefly regretted in the whole matter was not so much the loss of the distinguished captains who were the very soul of his vast enterprise, as that he had led the world to believe, in a way so fatal to his own interest, that he could for a single instant fail to recognize their merit, adding that he consequently relied upon him, Paolo Orsino, whom he had always cared for most, to bring back the confederates by a peace which would be as much for the profit of all as a war was hurtful to all, and that he was ready to sign a treaty in consonance with their wishes so long as it should not prejudice his own honour. Orsino was the man Caesar wanted. Full of pride and confidence in himself, he was convinced of the truth of the old proverb that says, "A pope cannot reign 8 days if he has half the Colonnas and the Orsini against him." He believed, therefore, if not in Caesar's good faith, at any rate in the necessity he must feel for making peace. Accordingly he signed with him the following conventions, which only needed ratification, on the 18th of October, 1502, which we reproduce here as Machiavelli sent them to the magnificent Republic of Florence. Agreement between the Duke of Valentinois and the confederates. Let it be known to the parties mentioned below, and to all who shall see these presents, that His Excellency the Duke of Romagna, of the one part, and the Orsini of the other part, together with their confederates, desiring to put an end to differences, enmities, misunderstandings, and suspicions which have arisen between them, have resolved as follows. There shall be between them peace and alliance true and perpetual, with a complete obliteration of wrongs and injuries which may have taken place up to this day, both parties engaging to preserve no resentment of the same, and in conformity with the aforesaid peace and union, His Excellency the Duke of Romagna shall receive into perpetual confederation, league and alliance, all the lords aforesaid, and each of them shall promise to defend the estates of all in general, and of each in particular, against any power that may annoy or attack them for any cause whatsoever, excepting always nevertheless the Pope Alexandre VI and His very Christian Majesty Louis XII, King of France. The lords above named promising on the other part to unite in the defence of the person and estates of His Excellency, and also those of the most illustrious lords, Don Gaffredo Borgia, Prince of Squillace, Don Roderigo Borgia, Duke of Sermeta and Bicelli, and Don Gian Borgia, Duke of Camerino and Neggi, all brothers or nephews of the Duke of Romagna. Moreover, since the rebellion and usurpation of Urbino have occurred during the above-mentioned misunderstandings, all the confederates aforesaid, and each of them shall bind themselves to unite all their forces for the recovery of the estates aforesaid, and of such other places as have revolted and been usurped. His Excellency the Duke of Romagna shall undertake to continue to the Orsini and Vitelli their ancient engagements, in the way of military service, and on the same conditions. His Excellency promises further not to insist on the service in person of more than one of them, as they may choose. The service that the others may render shall be voluntary. He also promises that the second treaty shall be ratified by the Sovereign Pontiff, who shall not compel Cardinal Orsino to reside in Rome longer than shall seem convenient to this prelate. Furthermore, since there are certain differences between the Pope and the Lord Gian Bentivoglio, the confederates aforesaid agree that they shall be put to the arbitration of Cardinal Orsino, of His Excellency the Duke of Romagna, and of the Lord Pandolfo Petrucci, without appeal. Thus the confederates engage, each and all, so soon as they may be required by the Duke of Romagna, to put into his hands as a hostage one of the legitimate sons of each of them, in that place and at that time which he may be pleased to indicate. the same confederates promising, moreover, all and each, that if any project directed against any one of them come to their knowledge, to give warning thereof, and all to prevent such project reciprocally. It is agreed, over and above, between the Duke of Romagna and the confederates aforesaid, to regard as a common enemy any who shall fail to keep the present stipulations, and to unite in the destruction of any states not conforming thereto. Signed, Caesar Paolo Orsino, Agapit, Secretary. End of section number 23. Section 24 of Celebrated Crimes, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Morgan Scorpion. Celebrated Crimes, Volume 1 by Alexandre Dumas. Translated by G.B. Ives. Section 24. The Borgias, Chapter 13, Part 2. At the same time, while Orsino was carrying to the confederates the treaty drawn up between him and the Duke, Bentivoglio, not willing to submit to the arbitration indicated, made an offer to Caesar of settling their differences by a private treaty, and sent his son to arrange the conditions. After some parleying they were settled as follows. Bentivoglio should separate his fortunes from Vitelli and Orsini. He should furnish the Duke of Valentinois with 100 men-at-arms and 100 mounted archers for 8 years. He should pay 12,000 ducats per annum to Caesar for the support of 100 lances. In return for this, his son Hannibal was to marry the sister of the Archbishop of Enna, who was Caesar's niece, and the Pope was to recognize his sovereignty in Bologna. The King of France, the Duke of Ferrara, and the Republic of Florence were to be the guarantors of this treaty. But the convention brought to the confederates by Orsino was the cause of great difficulties on their part. Vitellozzo Vitelli in particular, who knew Caesar the best, never ceased to tell the other condottieri that so prompt and easy a peace must needs be the cover to some trap. But since Caesar had meanwhile collected a considerable army at Imola, and the 400 lances lent him by Louis XII had arrived at last, Vitellozzo and Oliverotto decided to sign the treaty that Orsino brought, and to let the Duke of Urbino and the Lord of Camerino know of it. They, seeing plainly that it was henceforth impossible to make a defence unaided, had retired, the one to Città di Castello, and the other into the kingdom of Naples. But Caesar, saying nothing of his intentions, started on the 10th of December, and made his way to Casenna with a powerful army once more under his command. Fear began to spread on all sides, not only in Romagna, but in the whole of northern Italy. Florence, seeing him move away from her, only thought it a blind to conceal his intentions, while Venice, seeing him approach her frontiers, dispatched all her troops to the banks of the Po. Caesar perceived their fear, and lest harm should be done to himself by the mistrust it might inspire, he sent away all French troops in his service as soon as he reached Casenna, except 100 men with Monsieur de Condali, his brother-in-law. It was then seen that he only had 2,000 cavalry and 2,000 infantry with him. Several days were spent in parleying, for at Casenna Caesar found the envoys of the Vitelli and Orsini, who themselves were with their army in the duchy of Urbino. But after the preliminary discussions as to the right course to follow in carrying on the plan of conquest, there arose such difficulties between the general-in-chief and these agents, that they could not but see the impossibility of getting anything settled by intermediaries, and the urgent necessity of a conference between Caesar and one of the chiefs. So Oliverotto ran the risk of joining the Duke in order to make proposals to him, either to march on Tuscany or to take Sinigalia, which was the only place in the duchy of Urbino that had not yet fallen into Caesar's power. Caesar's reply was that he did not desire to war upon Tuscany, because the Tuscans were his friends, but that he approved of the lieutenant's plans with regard to Sinigalia, and therefore was marching towards Fano. But the daughter of Frederick, the former Duke of Urbino, who held the town of Sinigalia, and who was called the Lady Prefect because she had married Gian della Rovere, whom his uncle Sixtus IV. Had made prefect of Rome, judging that it would be impossible to defend herself against the forces the Duke of Valentinois was bringing, left the citadel in the hands of a captain, recommending him to get the best terms he could for the town, and took boat for Venice. Caesar learned this news at Rimini, through a messenger from Vitelli and the Orsini, who said that the governor of the citadel, though refusing to yield to them, was quite ready to make terms with him, and consequently they would engage to go to the town and finish the business there. Caesar's reply was that in consequence of this information he was sending some of his troops to Casenna and Imola, for they would be useless to him, as he should now have theirs, which together with the escort he retained would be sufficient, since his only object was the complete pacification of the Duchy of Urbino. He added that this pacification would not be possible if his old friends continued to distrust him, and to discuss through intermediaries alone plans in which their own fortunes were interested as well as his. The messenger returned with this answer, and the confederates, though feeling, it is true, the justice of Caesar's remarks, none the less hesitated to comply with his demand. Vitellozzo Vitelli in particular showed a want of confidence in him which nothing seemed able to subdue, but, pressed by Oliverotto, Gravina, and Orsino, he consented at last to await the duke's coming, making concession rather because he could not bear to appear more timid than his companions, than because of any confidence he felt in the return of friendship that Borgia was displaying. The duke learned the news of this decision, so much desired, when he arrived at Fano on the 20th of December, 1502. At once he summoned 8 of his most faithful friends, amongst whom were Denna, his nephew Michelotto, and Ugo di Cardona, and ordered them, as soon as they arrived at Sinigalia, and had seen Vitellozzo, Gravina, Oliverata, and Gorsino come out to meet them, on a pretext of doing them honour, to place themselves on the right and left hand of the 4 generals, 2 beside each, so that at a given signal they might either stab or arrest them. Next he assigned to each of them his particular man, bidding them not quit his side until he had re-entered Sinigalia and arrived at the quarters prepared for him. Then he sent orders to such of the soldiers as were in cantonments in the neighbourhood to assemble to the number of 8,000 on the banks of the Meteras, a little river of Umbria, which runs into the Adriatic and has been made famous by the defeat of Hannibal. The duke arrived at the rendezvous given to his army on the 31st of December, and instantly sent out in front 200 horse, and immediately behind them his infantry, following close in the midst of his men-at-arms, following the coast of the Adriatic, with the mountains on his right and the sea on his left, which in part of the way left only space for the army to march 10 abreast. After 4 hours' march, the duke at a turn of the path perceived Sinigalia, nearly a mile distant from the sea, and a bowshot from the mountains. Between the army and the town ran a little river, whose banks he had to follow for some distance. At last he found a bridge opposite a suburb of the town, and here Caesar ordered his cavalry to stop. It was drawn up in 2 lines, one between the road and the river, the other on the side of the country, leaving the whole width of the road to the infantry, which latter defiled, crossed the bridge, and entering the town, drew themselves up in battle array in the great square. On their side Vitellozzo, Gravina, Orsino, and Oliverotto, to make room for the duke's army, had quartered their soldiers in little towns or villages in the neighbourhood of Sinigalia. Oliverotto alone had kept nearly 1,000 infantry and 150 horse, who were in barracks in the suburb through which the duke entered. Caesar had made only a few steps towards the town when he perceived Vitellozzo at the gate, with the Duke of Gravina and Orsino, who all came out to meet him, the last 2 quite gay and confident, but the first so gloomy and dejected that you would have thought he foresaw the fate that was in store for him, and doubtless he had not been without same presentiments, for when he left his army to come to Sinigalia, he had bidden them farewell as though never to meet again, had commended the care of his family to the captains, and embraced his children with tears, a weakness which appeared strange to all who knew him as a brave condottiere. The duke marched up to them, holding out his hand, as a sign that all was over and forgotten, and did it with an air at once so loyal and so smiling, that Gravina and Orsino could no longer doubt the genuine return of his friendship. and it was only Vitellozza still appeared sad. At the same moment, exactly as they had been commanded, the Duke's accomplices took their posts on the right and left of those they were to watch, who were all there except Oliverotto, whom the Duke could not see, and began to seek with uneasy looks. But as he crossed the suburb he perceived him exercising his troops on the square. Caesar at once dispatched Micheletto and Denner with a message that it was a rash thing to have his troops out, when they might easily start some quarrel with the Duke's men and bring about an affray. It would be much better to settle them in barracks, and then come to join his companions, who were with Caesar. Oliverotto, drawn by the same fate as his friends, made no objection, ordered his soldiers indoors, and put his horse to the gallop to join the Duke, escorted on either side by Denner and Micheletto. Caesar, on seeing him, called him, took him by the hand, and continued his march to the palace that had been prepared for him, his 4 victims following after. Arrived on the threshold, Caesar dismounted, and, signing to the leader of the men-at-arms to await his orders, he went in first, followed by Oliverotto, Gravina, Vitellozzo Vitelli, and Orsino, each accompanied by his 2 satellites. But scarcely had they gone upstairs and into the first room, when the door was shut behind them, and Caesar turned round, saying, "The hour has come." This was the signal agreed upon. Instantly the former confederates were seized, thrown down, and forced to surrender with a dagger at their throat. Then, while they were being carried to a dungeon, Caesar opened the window, went out on the balcony, and cried out to the leader of his men-at-arms, "Go forward!" The man was in the secret. He rushed on with his band towards the barracks where Oliverotto's soldiers had just been consigned, and they, suddenly surprised and off their guard, were at once made prisoners. Then the Duke's troops began to pillage the town, and he summoned Machiavelli. Caesar and the Florentine envoy were nearly 2 hours shut up together, and since Machiavelli himself recounts the history of this interview, we will give his own words. "He summoned me," says the Florentine ambassador, "and in the calmest manner showed me his joy at the success of this enterprise, which he assured me he had spoken of to me the evening before. I remember that he did, but I did not at that time understand what he meant. Next he explained, in terms of much feeling and lively affection for our city, the different motives which had made him desire your alliance, a desire to which he hopes you will respond. He ended with charging me to lay 3 proposals before your lordships: first, that you rejoice with him in the destruction at a single blow of the mortal enemies of the king, himself, and you, and the consequent disappearance of all seeds of trouble and dissension likely to waste Italy. This service of his, together with his refusal to allow the prisoners to march against you, ought, he thinks, to excite your gratitude towards him. Secondly, he begs that you will at this juncture give him a striking proof of your friendliness, by urging your cavalry's advance towards Borgo, and there assembling some infantry also, in order that they may march with him, should need arise, on Castello or on Perugia. Lastly, he desires, and this is his 3rd condition, that you arrest the Duke of Urbino, if he should flee from Castello into your territories, when he learns that Vitellozzo is a prisoner. When I objected that to give him up would not beseem the dignity of the Republic, and that you would never consent, he approved of my words, and said that it would be enough for you to keep the Duke, and not give him his liberty without his Excellency's permission. I have promised to give you all this information, to which he awaits your reply." The same night 8 masked men descended to the dungeon where the prisoners lay. They believed at that moment that the fatal hour had arrived for all. But this time the executioners had to do with Vitellozzo and Oliverotto alone. When these 2 captains heard that they were condemned, Oliverotto burst forth into reproaches against Vitellozzo, saying that it was all his fault that they had taken up arms against the Duke. Not a word Vitellozzo answered except a prayer that the Pope might grant him plenary indulgence for all his sins. Then the masked men took them away, leaving Orsino and Gravina to await a similar fate, and led away the 2 chosen out to die to a secluded spot outside the ramparts of the town, where they were strangled and buried at once in 2 trenches that had been dug beforehand. The 2 others were kept alive until it should be known if the Pope had arrested Cardinal Orsino, Archbishop of Florence and Lord of Santa Croce, and when the answer was received in the affirmative from His Holiness, Gravina and Orsino, who had been transferred to a castle, were likewise strangled. The Duke, leaving instructions with Michelotto, set off for Sinigalia as soon as the first execution was over, assuring Machiavelli that he had never had any other thought than that of giving tranquillity to the Romagna and to Tuscany, and also that he thought he had succeeded by taking and putting to death the men who had been the cause of all the trouble, also that any other revolt that might take place in the future would be nothing but sparks that a drop of water could extinguish. The Pope had barely learned that Caesar had his enemies in his power when, eager to play the same winning game himself, he announced to Cardinal Orsino, though it was then midnight, that his son had taken Sinigalia, and gave him an invitation to come the next morning and talk over the good news. The cardinal, delighted at this increase of favour, did not miss his appointment. So in the morning he started on horseback for the Vatican, but at a turn of the first street he met the governor of Rome with a detachment of cavalry, who congratulated him on the happy chance that they were taking the same road, and accompanied him to the threshold of the Vatican. There the cardinal dismounted and began to ascend the stairs. Scarcely, however, had he reached the first landing before his mules and carriages were seized and shut in the palace stables. When he entered the hall of the Perropont, he found that he and all his suite were surrounded by armed men, who led him into another apartment, called the Vicar's Hall, where he found the Abbot Alviano, the protonotary Orsino, Jacopo Santa Croce, and Rinaldo Orsino, who were all prisoners like himself. At the same time the governor received orders to seize the castle of Monte Giardino, which belonged to the Orsini, and take away all the jewels, all the hangings, all the furniture, and all the silver that he might find. The governor carried out his orders conscientiously, and brought to the Vatican everything he seized, down to the cardinal's account book. On consulting the book, the Pope found out two things: first, that a sum of 2,000 ducats was due to the cardinal, no debtor's name being mentioned; secondly, that the cardinal had bought 3 months before, for 1,500 Roman crowns, a magnificent pearl which could not be found among the objects belonging to him, on which Alexander ordered that from that very moment until the negligence in the cardinal's account was repaired, the men who were in the habit of bringing him food twice a day on behalf of his mother should not be admitted into the Castle St. Angelo. The same day the cardinal's mother sent the Pope the 2,000 ducats, and the next day his mistress, in man's attire, came in person to bring the missing pearl. His Holiness, however, was so struck with her beauty in this costume that, we are told, he let her keep the pearl for the same price she had paid for it. Then the Pope allowed the cardinal to have his food brought as before, and he died of poison on the 22nd of February, that is, 2 days after his accounts had been set right. The same night the Prince of Squillaci set off to take possession, in the Pope's name, of the lands of the deceased. End of section 24.